The dust swirled across the auction platform like a devil's dance as Grace Foster stood trembling, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin. Cattle Canyon, Wyoming Territory, 1878 was no place for a woman alone, especially not one whose family fortune had been gambled away, leaving her to be sold to cover her late father's debts. Next up, Miss Foster, educated back east, can cook, clean, and read. Bidding starts at $50, barked the auctioneer, a tobacco-stained smile spreading across his weathered face. Grace's chin lifted despite the humiliation burning her cheeks. She scanned the crowd of rough men gathered in the town square, their hungry eyes assessing her like they would a prized mare. Most were ranchers looking for a wife or housekeeper, some were saloon owners seeking entertainment. All made her skin crawl. From the back of the crowd, a figure moved forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. Unlike the others, he didn't leer or call out crude remarks. He simply watched, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. $50. "Do I hear 60? The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip. 60, called a portly man with a red face and wandering eyes. 70, countered another. The bidding continued, and Grace felt herself growing faint. The summer heat pressed down, and the knowledge that her future, her very body, was being bartered made her stomach churn. $200, came a deep voice from the back. The crowd fell silent, turning to look at the tall stranger who had finally spoken. 200 going once, twice. "Sold to the gentleman in the back. Approach and claim your property, sir." Grace watched through a haze of tears as the man strode forward. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the stubble that shadowed his face. "Your name, sir, for the record?" asked the auctioneer. "Caleb Carson," he replied, his voice like gravel. He handed over the money without counting it, then approached Grace. She flinched as he reached for her bound wrists, but his touch was unexpectedly gentle as he worked at the knots. "Why would you buy me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of the dispersing crowd. Caleb's eyes met hers, something flickering in their depths that might have been pain. "Because no one bought my loneliness," he answered simply. He finished untying her bonds and stepped back, giving her space. "I have a ranch 10 miles north. You'll have your own room, your own space." "I need help running the place, nothing more." Grace rubbed her chafed wrists, studying him warily. "And if I refuse," a faint smile touched his lips. "Miss Foster, this isn't a prison sentence, but the alternatives in Cattle Canyon aren't kind to women. I offer safety, food, and fair treatment." He paused. "And when you've worked off the $200, you're free to go wherever you please." It was more than she'd hoped for, yet suspicion kept her guarded. Men didn't pay good money for women without expecting something in return. "My horse is at the hitching post. We should leave before dark if we want to reach the ranch before nightfall." He gestured toward a beautiful buckskin gelding waiting patiently nearby. With few options and fewer friends, Grace followed Caleb Carson to his horse, allowing him to help her mount before he swung up behind her. As they rode out of town, the setting sun painting the distant mountains in hues of fire, Grace wondered what kind of man had just purchased her freedom, or perhaps merely changed the nature of her chains. The trail to Caleb's ranch wound through stands of pine and aspen, climbing steadily into the foothills. For the first few miles, they rode in silence, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. "May I ask about your circumstances, Miss Foster?" Caleb finally said, his deep voice rumbling against her back. Grace stiffened. "My father was a businessman who made poor investments and worse gambling decisions. When he died 6 months ago, his creditors seized everything, including me, apparently." "I'm sorry for your loss," he replied, and she was surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "Are you?" she challenged. "It provided you with a bargain household servant," she felt rather than heard his sigh. "I didn't come to town looking to buy a person, Miss Foster. I came for supplies, but I've seen what happens to women sold at those auctions. The saloons and brothels get most of them. Grace swallowed hard. She knew he was right. She'd heard the whispers of other women's fates while awaiting her turn on the auction block. "Thank you for that much, at least," she conceded. As they crested a rise, Caleb pointed ahead. "There it is, Carson Creek Ranch." In the fading light, Grace could make out a sturdy two-story house built of logs and stone, a large barn, and several outbuildings. A creek wound through the property, reflecting the orange glow of sunset. It was beautiful in a rugged way, but what struck her most was its isolation. They hadn't passed another homestead for miles. "It's remote," she observed. 10 miles to town, 5 to my nearest neighbor," Caleb confirmed. "Winters can be hard, but the land is good and the water never fails." As they approached the ranch house, Grace noticed the careful attention to detail, the vegetable garden fenced against wildlife, the well-maintained buildings, the neat woodpile stacked against the coming winter. This was no neglected bachelor's hovel. A dog came bounding out to meet them, a black and white border collie who barked enthusiastically until Caleb spoke a quiet word of command. The dog immediately sat, tail still wagging as they dismounted. "That's Scout," Caleb said, helping Grace down from the horse. "He's friendly once he knows you belong here." Belong. The word struck her oddly. She didn't belong here or anywhere, not anymore. Caleb led her into the house, lighting a lamp that revealed a surprisingly comfortable interior. The main room had a large stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and bookshelves lining one wall filled with books, she noted with surprise. "The kitchen's through there," Caleb gestured. "My room is downstairs, just off the back porch. Yours will be upstairs." "There are 2 bedrooms, take whichever you prefer." Grace looked at him suspiciously. "You're giving me a choice?" "Like I said, this isn't a prison," he replied, moving to stoke the banked fire in the hearth. "Are you hungry? I can fix something simple before you settle in." "I can cook," she said quickly. It's the least I can do." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Pantry's stocked. Use whatever you need." The kitchen was well appointed with a cast iron stove, a pump at the sink that drew water from a well, and cupboards filled with provisions. Grace found herself relaxing slightly as she prepared a simple meal of bacon, beans, and cornbread. Cooking was familiar, something she could control in a situation where she had so little agency. They ate at the sturdy oak table, another silence stretching between them, though this one felt less strained. After the meal, Caleb showed her upstairs to the 2 bedrooms. One was plainly furnished but comfortable, the other slightly larger with a window seat overlooking the creek. "This was my mother's room," Caleb said quietly, indicating the larger room. "She had a fondness for watching the sunrise over the water." "Had?" Grace questioned softly. "She passed 3 years ago, my father 5 years before that." His expression remained neutral, but Grace caught a flicker of old pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she offered, meaning it this time. Caleb nodded acknowledgement. "There are clothes in the trunk that might fit you. My mother was about your size. Use whatever you need." "We'll start fresh in the morning." With that, he left her alone, his footsteps retreating down the stairs. Grace stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by the day's events. Hours ago, she'd been bound on an auction block, certain her fate would be unspeakable. Now she found herself in a clean, comfortable room in a home that, while isolated, seemed safe. She opened the trunk at the foot of the bed to find neatly folded dresses, undergarments, and nightclothes. Selecting a simple cotton nightgown, she changed quickly, then moved to the window seat. Outside, the moon had risen, bathing the landscape in silver light. In the distance, she could see Caleb in the barn tending to his horse. What kind of man purchases a woman at auction, gives her his mother's room, and then leaves her completely alone? What was he not telling her? And most troubling of all, why did she find herself hoping his story of needing household help was the truth, when experience had taught her that men rarely did anything without expecting something in return? Grace slept fitfully that first night, waking at every unfamiliar sound: the creek's gentle gurgle, the wind in the pines, the occasional howl of a distant wolf. When dawn finally broke, she rose and dressed in one of the simpler dresses from the trunk, relieved to be in clean clothes that actually fit after weeks of wearing the same travel-worn garments. She made her way downstairs to find the house empty, though the front door stood open, letting in the crisp morning air. Through the doorway, she could see Caleb by the corral, working with a spirited young horse. She watched for a moment, noting the patient, firm way he handled the animal, no harsh words or rough treatment, just steady persistence. In the kitchen, she found coffee already made, still warm on the stove. She poured herself a cup and set about preparing breakfast, feeling a strange determination to prove her worth. By the time Caleb came in, wiping sweat from his brow, she had bacon frying, biscuits in the oven, and a pot of oatmeal simmering. "Morning," he said, looking surprised at the spread. "You didn't have to do all this." "I need to earn my keep," Grace replied, turning back to the stove to hide the flush creeping up her neck, "and cooking is something I do well." "I can see that," he said, pouring himself coffee. "After breakfast, I can show you around the ranch if you'd like." The tour revealed a well-run operation larger than Grace had initially realized. Besides the main house and barn, there was a bunkhouse for the occasional hired help, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, a small orchard, and pastureland stretching to the foothills. Caleb ran about 100 head of cattle, he explained, with plans to expand. "You manage all this alone?" Grace asked, incredulous. Caleb nodded. "I hire men during roundup and branding, but day to day it's just me. My father believed in self-sufficiency." "And your mother?" "Did she help with the ranch work?" A shadow passed over his face. "She did everything. Cooking, cleaning, mending, gardening, even helped with calving when needed. After we lost her, I managed," but he broke off, looking away. "The house has suffered, I'm afraid." Grace understood then. He hadn't purchased her for nefarious purposes or even simple loneliness. He needed someone to maintain the domestic side of ranch life, tasks he'd been struggling with alone. "I can help with all of that," she said firmly. "I may have been raised in the city, but I'm not afraid of hard work." For the first time, she saw a genuine smile transform his face, softening the hard angles and making him look younger, almost handsome. "I believe you, Miss Foster," he said. "Grace," she corrected him. "If we're to live under the same roof, you might as well use my given name." "Grace," he repeated, the words sounding different in his deep voice. "And I'm Caleb." Days fell into a rhythm at Carson Creek Ranch. Grace took charge of the house, attacking years of bachelor neglect with vigor. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, mended linens, and cooked meals that gradually coaxed more conversation from the taciturn rancher. Caleb, for his part, seemed to relax incrementally as the weeks passed. He began to linger at the table after meals, sometimes reading aloud from one of his many books while Grace mended or preserved vegetables from the garden. He taught her to ride properly, surprising her with the gift of a gentle mare he'd been training, explaining that she needed to be mobile around the ranch. "She's yours," he said as Grace stroked the chestnut horse's velvety nose. "Her name's Penny." "Caleb, I can't accept it's not a gift," he clarified. "Consider it part of your wages. A ranch hand needs a horse." She wanted to argue but saw the stubborn set of his jaw and relented. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace found herself studying Caleb's profile, wondering about the life he'd led before her arrival. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured. He turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised. "You can ask." "You're not an unattractive man with a good ranch and obvious capabilities." She hesitated, then pressed on. "Why were you alone when you found me? Surely there were women in town who would have been happy to marry a rancher with property." Caleb was silent for so long that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "There was someone once, Emily. We were to be married 5 years ago." He stared out at the darkening landscape. "There was a raid on a neighboring ranch, Comanche. I joined the men who went after them. While I was gone, Emily fell ill with fever by the time I returned." His voice faltered. "By the time I returned, she was buried." "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered. He shrugged, the gesture failing to mask his pain. "After that, the women in town seemed to find reasons to avoid me. Some said I was cursed, bringing death to those close to me. First my father, then Emily, then my mother." He gave a humorless laugh. "Superstitious nonsense, but it stuck, and I found I preferred my own company anyway." Until you didn't, Grace said softly. Their eyes met in the gathering dusk. Until I didn't, he agreed. As summer turned to fall, Grace found herself thinking less about paying off her debt and leaving, and more about the ways she could improve life at Carson Creek. She expanded the vegetable garden, bartered with a traveling peddler for seeds to plant flowers around the house, and began the painstaking work of braiding a rug for the main room from scraps of old clothing. Caleb noticed these efforts, his eyes following her with increasing frequency. Sometimes she would look up from her work to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between wonder and wariness, as if she were a wild creature that might flee if approached too quickly. The first snowfall came earlier than expected, blanketing the ranch in white overnight. Grace woke to find Caleb already out tending to the livestock, ensuring they had access to feed and unfrozen water. When he finally returned to the house, his cheeks ruddy with cold, she had hot coffee and a hearty breakfast waiting. "You're becoming indispensable, Grace Foster," he said, warming his hands around the coffee mug. Something in his tone made her breath catch. "Am I? You know you are." He met her eyes directly. "You've brought life back to this place. I didn't realize how dead it had become until you arrived." Grace felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fire in the hearth. "The ranch was never dead, Caleb, just waiting." "For what?" he asked, his voice dropping lower. "For someone to care for it again," she answered, holding his gaze. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken feelings. Then Scout barked outside, breaking the spell, and Caleb rose to check what had disturbed the dog. That night, a blizzard descended on the mountains, howling around the ranch house like a living thing. Grace lay awake in her bed, listening to the wind and thinking about the changing nature of her feelings toward Caleb Carson. What had begun as gratitude for rescue from a terrible fate had evolved into respect for his quiet strength and integrity. And now there was something more, something that quickened her pulse when he entered a room and left her watching the trail when he rode out to check the herd. A particularly violent gust rattled the window, and Grace sat up, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. Unable to sleep, she decided to go downstairs for some warm milk. The house was dark except for the glow of banked coals in the fireplace. As she passed through the main room, a shadow by the window made her gasp. "It's just me," came Caleb's voice. "The storm woke me too." He stood by the window, watching the snow swirl in the darkness. In the dim light, with his guard down, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "Is everything all right with the animals?" Grace asked, moving to stand beside him. "They're fine. The barn is solid." He glanced down at her. "You're shivering. Here." Before she could protest, he had draped a warm woolen blanket around her shoulders, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary. Grace was acutely aware of his proximity, the clean scent of soap and leather that always surrounded him. "Thank you," she murmured. They stood together watching the storm, somehow more comfortable in this midnight silence than they had been in many daylight conversations. "I never asked what your plans are," Caleb said suddenly. "After you've worked off the $200, the question startled Grace. She'd been at the ranch nearly 4 months now, and they'd never discussed her eventual departure. I haven't thought that far ahead." "You should," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're nearly halfway there by my calculations." Grace felt a sudden hollow sensation in her chest. Are you eager to be rid of me?" Caleb turned to face her fully, his expression hidden in shadow. "That's about the furthest thing from the truth, Grace Foster." "Then why?" "Because you deserve choices," he interrupted. "Real ones, not just the lesser of bad options. You're educated, capable. You could start a business in town, maybe a bakery or a dress shop, or take the stage east, return to civilization. And if I chose to stay," the words slipped out before she could reconsider them. Caleb went very still. "Do you want to stay?" Grace took a deep breath. "I've come to care for this place, for the life here." She hesitated, then added softly, "For you." His sharp intake of breath was the only sound beyond the howling wind. Then, slowly, he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingertips grazing her cheek. "I told myself I wouldn't do this," he said, his voice rough. "That I wouldn't take advantage of your situation. "It's not taking advantage if it's what I want to," Grace whispered. The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. Grace answered by stepping closer, her hands coming to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart racing beneath her palm, matching the frantic beat of her own. When they finally broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day I taught you to ride, Penny," he confessed. Grace smiled in the darkness. "I've wanted you to since the night you told me about Emily." They stayed by the window until the storm began to abate, talking in low voices about possibilities neither had dared consider before. When Grace finally returned to her room, it was with the knowledge that everything had changed and with the hope that perhaps she had found not just sanctuary at Carson Creek Ranch, but a home. The days that followed were filled with a new awareness, a current of anticipation humming between them. Caleb began joining Grace for evening walks along the creek, their gloved hands finding each other as naturally as breathing. They spoke of their pasts more openly, Grace of her sheltered upbringing in Boston and the shock of her father's death and debts. Caleb of his childhood on the ranch and his brief time riding with the Texas Rangers before returning home to care for his ailing mother. As winter settled in earnest, the ranch became a snow-bound island. Days were filled with chores, caring for livestock, preserving food, mending equipment, while evenings were spent in the warm kitchen or by the hearth. Caleb taught Grace to play chess. She taught him songs from her childhood in Boston. Sometimes they simply read together, content in shared silence. Christmas approached, bringing with it a brief thaw that allowed Caleb to make the treacherous journey into Cattle Canyon for supplies. Grace spent his absence preparing small gifts: a knitted scarf, cookies made from hoarded sugar, a drawing of Scout she'd been working on in secret. When Caleb returned late on Christmas Eve, half frozen but triumphant, he carried not just necessities but treasures: coffee, chocolate, a bolt of pretty blue fabric, and most precious of all, a small volume of poetry Grace had once mentioned loving as a girl. "How did you possibly find this?" she exclaimed, running her fingers over the embossed cover. Caleb shrugged but looked pleased. "The new schoolteacher had it. When I described what I was looking for, she offered to sell it." That night, as they sat before the fire with mugs of chocolate, Caleb surprised her by producing one final gift: a small wooden box he'd clearly carved himself. Inside, nestled on a scrap of velvet, was a delicate silver ring set with a small blue stone. "It was my grandmother's," he explained, watching her face anxiously. "My mother always said it should go to the woman who brought happiness back to Carson Creek." Grace looked from the ring to Caleb, her heart in her throat. "What are you asking me, Caleb Carson?" He took her hands in his usually confident expression replaced by vulnerability. "I'm asking if you'll stay, not as someone working off a debt, but as my wife, my partner in everything. People will talk," she warned, even as joy bloomed in her chest. "They'll say you bought yourself a bride." "Let them talk," he said firmly. "We know the truth. I may have purchased your freedom, but your heart was your own to give or withhold." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "And I give it freely." The kiss they shared sealed more than a betrothal. It marked the healing of two wounded souls who had found in each other not just companionship, but completion. They were married in the spring, when the mountain snow melted and the first wildflowers appeared in the meadows around Carson Creek. The ceremony was small, held in the newly built church in Cattle Canyon with only a handful of witnesses, neighboring ranchers, the schoolteacher who had provided the poetry book, and the minister and his wife. If there were whispers about the woman Caleb Carson had bought at auction, they faded quickly in the face of the couple's obvious devotion. Grace's natural warmth and Caleb's quiet generosity gradually won over even the most suspicious townspeople. Their first year of marriage brought challenges: a drought that threatened the herd, a bout of illness that left Caleb bedridden for weeks, the lingering prejudices of a few stubborn souls in town. But it also brought deep joy as they built their life together, expanding the ranch operations to include a small apple orchard and a flock of sheep whose wool Grace learned to spin and weave. On their first anniversary, Grace presented Caleb with news that left him speechless with happiness. They would welcome a child before the year's end. Their daughter, Catherine Emily Carson, arrived on a crisp November morning, inheriting her mother's golden curls and her father's storm gray eyes. As Grace sat in the rocking chair by the fire, nursing their daughter while Caleb read aloud from their favorite book of poetry, she reflected on the strange path that had led her to this moment of perfect contentment. How close she had come to a life of degradation and misery. How fortunate that Caleb had been in town that day, had seen her plight, had spoken those words that changed everything. Because no one bought my loneliness. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, noticing her faraway expression. "About luck and fate," she answered honestly. "About how sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best." Caleb set aside the book and knelt beside her chair, one hand gently stroking his daughter's downy head, the other finding Grace's fingers. "Not luck," he corrected softly. "Providence." Grace smiled, leaning forward to kiss him. "Whatever you want to call it, I'm grateful, every day." As darkness fell over Carson Creek Ranch, the little family remained by the fire, surrounded by the home they had created together, a sanctuary built not from obligation or transaction, but from choice, respect, and love freely given. In the years that followed, the ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. 2 more children joined the family, a son, James, and another daughter, Sarah. The house expanded to accommodate their growing family and the occasional guests who found their way to Carson Creek, drawn by the couple's reputation for hospitality. Grace never forgot the day she stood trembling on that auction block, certain her life was ending. Instead, it had been just beginning. The woman who had been sold to pay a dead man's debts had found not servitude but partnership, not captivity but freedom in the arms of a lonely cowboy who had only wanted someone to care for his home and had found someone to share his heart.